Welcome to Sacred Stories Podcast, a place to explore and discuss new and exciting books of consciousness. I am your host, Reverend Patricia Caginello, and speaking with authors that have shared their wisdom, stories, and a higher consciousness through their books is one of my favorite things to do. Today we are speaking with Dee Delaney, yogi and author of the trilogy of books, The Truth is Within. This beautiful trilogy chronicles Dee's true life story of living through the death of 3 partners and her soul's subsequent journey deep into the heart of the divine. So welcome, Dee Delaney, to Sacred Stories.
Hello, Patricia. It's good to be here.
Yes, I'm very happy to have you. And congratulations on writing The Truth is Within. A trilogy is quite an accomplishment.
It is, and it seemed to be calling me to write these books. Really wanted to come out to the world, and so I'm very glad to share them with everybody.
So, an overview of the trilogy. There's 3 books. If you could let us know the name of each book and just generally what it's about, we'll dive into each one a little bit deeper in just a moment.
So my first book is called The Truth, My Journey to the Other Side, and it's a journey of the soul through the healing the body through Eastern philosophy and Western wisdom. The second book is The Truth is the Art of Dying, is the Art of Being. Sorry, let me start that again, Patricia. The second book is The Truth is the Art of Being, is a journey through the death realms and a taming of the mind. The third book, The Truth Within the Heart of Love, is the union of the masculine and feminine and a meeting of spirit and soul at the heart.
And so woven into that, but it is your story, which is so beautiful. It is your personal journey and a very heart-opening and I think would imagine at times very difficult journey. Can you share your sacred story of what led you to write this trilogy?
So very briefly, I experienced a lot of death, and the catalyst was my husband dying suddenly. Prior to that, my first partner died, and then I had a third partner die. So within the space of 5 years, as a young woman in my early 40s, I'd experienced the death of 3 men in my life. And at the time I was living in the West, and I had what some might consider to be the perfect life, the Western dream. I was working at the BBC and I had a big job and my life was fabulous. But when these deaths came to me, I decided to give it all up. And I moved to the East. I trained as a yoga teacher and I embraced my spiritual life. And myself and my little boy moved to a fishing village in Goa, India, where we live now and where the trilogy was born.
What I love about your books is that you do beautifully weave your true life story and these deeper spiritual teachings that you've not only learned, you've experienced, you've lived through them, and you share them as you share your stories. It's really they're really wonderful reads, wonderful and inspiring and filled with wisdom, Dee.
I understood that when I wrote my first book, if I'm honest, Patricia, it was just for my son because he was only 1 when his daddy died. But what happened was, as I was writing the books, I was starting to heal. My writing was healing me. And I realized that if I could heal me through my writing, then I could share that healing with others. And that's how the trilogy was born. It was about sharing this light that was coming through me into the books.
Healing is healing. Writing is very cathartic, very healing, I would say.
It's completely cathartic, but raw, challenging, disciplined. I think any writer will understand these words. It calls you to yourself in the purest of way. And if I was to give my name to these books, I had to really look deep into my heart and look into some of the wounds that I was carrying that created this life that I had created for myself.
That is true. And I appreciate, see, that's what I think I really appreciate about you and your books, right? Because saying that healing or writing is healing, wow, I keep wanting to say it the other way. Writing is very healing, very cathartic, is kind of the prettied up end version of it. But you're right. Anyone who has written anything that was their personal work or story in any way, it's all of that and more. That's the journey to the cathartic healing ending.
I think as well, as I started to get feedback from my first book, the one thing that everyone says is, oh my gosh, I can see myself in your story, Dee. The story of loss and grief and death and healing and love is my personal story, but it's also everyone's story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was powerful to know that my story was touching the hearts of others and inviting them, if you will, to look at their lives. That's when I knew there was some magic in those words.
On a personal note, that's why I'm just so excited that the Sacred Stories podcast is really part of the larger Sacred Stories publishing, and we do book publishing because for me, the written word, the books, it's a beautiful invitation for others to have their own experience without telling them what they're supposed to think or what they're supposed to learn or how it's supposed to be. It's just an invitation, to them. It's an invitation to their heart.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think my books have been an invitation, as you say, to step into the heart, to, if I can look at myself in really quite a deep way, I think it encourages others. And I cover pretty much every subject there is to cover, grief, death, murder, rape. I mean, everything, every scope of life, nothing kind of gets hidden behind this body of work. And so that empowers people to talk about their own suffering and their difficulties and challenges in life. And that's how we heal collectively and individually.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about each individual book. So your first book is called The Truth, My Journey to the Other Side. Can you share what the book is about?
So this is really a journey of how I reflect on my life up to the point where my husband died. I talk about my life with my husband, and then how in 2015 I had this almost awakening moment where I was so consumed with grief with my husband's death that I needed to stop doing and sit in the silence to listen to my soul, who was crying to be heard. This brought me to India when I came with 2 girlfriends, and I realized I needed to move to India to heal. There was this immense call for me to do the work to heal my heart. So the book ends with me coming to India and starting a new life in a little fishing village in South Goa with my son.
Mm-hmm. Well, don't tell people endings, right? We want to keep them. We want to keep them hanging. But the first book is really your story with your husband, right? Your life, Martin's death, and the subsequent grief you experienced, and the beginning, really the beginning of the inner journey, right?
Yes. So shall I talk about that again?
No, that was perfect. It's just a really is a story, and it's perfect. And and I thoroughly enjoyed your first book. So the second book, The Truth, is the Art of Being, is is about what? What happens then? It's a continuation. So what
It's a
happens?
continuation of my life in Goa. And what happens is I start to awaken to this higher presence as I'm writing and completing the first book. But then a young British backpacker is brutally murdered where we live. And I live, if you could imagine paradise, that's where I live in India. And this sent me on a journey of discovering about death and how we live and die through the richness of Tibetan Buddhism. And I went to northern India to explore the Bardo, which is the science of death and dying through Buddhism. And then I went back to the UK and I trained as a soul midwife, which, if you like, is the Western expression and wisdom of death and dying. And what I realized was that I was being called to integrate East and West through my story and to bring the two wisdoms together, which I don't think has ever been done before.
So in the second book, which is so interesting in the sense that death really did kind of follow you, right? And so you went to India to heal from the grief of the death of Martin, and then you were really affected by a brutal murder of a young backpacker. And so book two for me was so fascinating because you do dive deeper into the spiritual teachings. You really weave the wisdom of what these teachings are throughout your personal experience with them. And
Yeah.
it was fascinating to read.
You know, if any of your listeners have ever tried to read the Bardo, which is the Tibetan book of the dead, it's one of the most complex books one can almost read. I actually don't know anybody who ever has read it other than a lama from back to front. But what I realized, Patricia, was this wisdom was inside me. And I read the Bardo from back to front, but not only read it, I could distill it into 21st century language and make it understandable. And I could do that because I was coming from a lineage of soul midwives, which looks at death from a, if you like, an almost feminine aspect. And it looks at how we are elemental beings made of water and earth and fire and air. And when we die, these elements break down in our body, and the essence of mother and father meet at the heart. The chains of the heart open, and spirit and soul is liberated to reincarnate. It was only until I trained as a soul midwife did the wisdom of the Bardo make absolute sense to me.
I found that absolutely fascinating because you literally walk us through a person's transition and what is happening in the body at that time and through the different elements. And I did not know that. And it is such a gift for you to again be able to pull those teachings and write them in a way that is so easily understandable. And I would imagine that anyone who has ever been in the presence of someone as they transitioned would just find that just incredibly important, for them to know, and I would think very soothing in many ways to what they experienced.
It's so, it's so encouraging because death isn't the end. And the reason why I wanted to write this book was I wasn't there when my husband died, and that hurt beyond you can imagine, because I am gifted with this ability to travel with souls in the after realm, in the astral realm. So to have that gift and to have not been there when my husband died was really painful for me. So it healed my heart learning that when he journeyed on, he was met by his loved ones and he's still there. Spirit and soul, spirit is the imprint of who we are in this life, and is always there, always ever present for us to connect with. And soul is the divine essence of all our beings that journeys on and lives many other lives. And I never knew that. And so I learned myself so much about this process of life and death and the natural cycle of life.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating. And then book 3, The Truth Within the Heart of Love. Tell us about that. How does your journey continue?
So when I came back to Goa, I had this strong sense that I needed to integrate, if you like, my East and West, my masculine and feminine. So I had this book about the goddess that I wanted to write. But the goddess came to me through teachings, actually, with sacred use, that your beautiful teachings that you have through your website. I sat and I spent hours and hours learning about the history of the goddess. And it was woven into the story of Yeshua, Jesus, and the divine feminine. And so I started to go on the search for the Holy Grail, which, if you like, is a metaphor for the unification of the masculine and feminine in the heart. I went to France and I started to visit many sites where the divine women in Jesus' lives were said to go after the crucifixion. And this story came to me in the most poetic and beautiful way.
And you write it in a very poetic way as well. So your writing style just changes just a little bit in the third book, which I think again is just so beautiful because it's the continuation of the journey, and you are not the same person, and your writing has shifted a little bit. I feel like within as you're shifting and changing and evolving, or whatever words we want to kind of wrap around it, as your journey continues, you as well are also.
Yeah, that's so true, Patricia, and it was the biggest surprise to me. I won't reveal, there were many things that happened to me on this voyage of discovery that surprised me, and I thought the book was complete and I was about to send it to you. And then this poetic voice started to come, and I basically, and it's the divine. Poetry is the language of the soul. And I talk about unity consciousness and the coming together of masculine and feminine. So the book is written in part in the voice of the feminine and in part in a linear voice of the masculine. And that was completely miraculous. So I managed to take pages and pages and pages of beautiful text and turn them into these sonnets, these poems that just spoke to my heart.
No, it's absolutely beautiful. So each book, I mean, they are a trilogy, it is your journey, but each book offers, I believe, the reader a different experience, which again is so aligned with our life. You know, it's hard to be on a journey and stay the same. So I love that the Truth is Within trilogy really mirrors and a beautiful journey of the soul. You know,
Yeah, if you like, I mean, for me, I kind of feel like book 1 has a very feminine essence, book 2 has a more masculine essence, and book 3 is the two coming together.
So what do you hope when people read your book or read the trilogy? What do you hope they receive?
I hope they find a little piece of themselves in the stories. And I hope that encourages them to look at their own lives. I hope it encourages them to open their eyes to a world that perhaps is not the way we think it is. And I hope they dream big for the future, to co-create a world that can be loving and kind, where we're all equal and we all walk the path of love.
So, Dee Delaney, your trilogy of books is The Truth is Within. Let our listeners know your website, how they can find you, and how they can order your books.
So you can contact me on deedelaney.co.uk. That's the website. And you can order my books through Amazon worldwide and other online retailers. And I will soon be producing a set of podcasts with Sacred Story Media, which will dive into some of the teachings of the books in slightly more detail. And I hope you can join us for that.
I'm very excited for those. So looking forward to those. So Dee Delaney, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you for inviting me on this podcast. It's much appreciated.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you to our listeners for listening. You've been with us for our Sacred Stories podcast, and you can find this podcast and many others on all streaming services and on our website, sacredstoriesmedia.com.